I stood beneath the dull, humming lights of Terminal B, my fingers curled tightly around a creased itinerary that had never meant to take me anywhere. The crowd moved around me like water breaking against stone families, hugging toddlers, whining couples, whispering plans for paradise. I couldn't move. My feet wouldn't obey. I kept staring at the space where my daughter and son-in-law had just disappeared. Serena's voice still rang in my ears, breezy and unapologetic. "You've got a phone. Sell it if you need bus fare." Todd hadn't even glanced at me. He rolled their matching luggage, mine included, into the priority lane, one hand casually resting in his blazer pocket, like nothing monumental had happened. I watched the backs of their heads until they were swallowed by the gate. I stood there empty-handed, empty-hearted, stunned by how smoothly they had orchestrated my removal. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. I shuffled to the gate agent, my voice brittle as I held out my boarding pass. She scanned it and paused. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This ticket is void. There's no return trip attached to your reservation." My mouth opened, then closed again. I turned to where Serena had been. The space was already filled by another family. I stepped out of line, shoulders stiff, heart hammering. The realization hit slowly, the way morning light creeps across cold tile. They hadn't forgotten anything. This was never an accident. It was a decision. They had smiled while doing it. The woman at the counter had offered to rebook me at my own expense. I thanked her numbly and walked away. I found a bench along the glass wall, dropped into it like a marionette with her strings cut. My hands trembled as I clutched the useless folder in my lap. My purse felt heavier than it should have, as if it sensed what I hadn't yet admitted. They had taken my trust and turned it into a one-way ticket to nowhere. And still part of me hoped it wasn't real, that Serena would turn around, that Todd would wave, that I wasn't as disposable as they had just proven I was, but they never looked back. It was a Thursday afternoon when Serena came by with lemon scones and forced sympathy. The funeral had passed 2 weeks earlier, but the silence in the house hadn't. I had stopped turning on the radio. Even the clink of spoons in the sink felt too loud. She sat at the kitchen table, like a guest in a stranger's home, not the child I'd once taught to braid her own hair. "You need a break, Mom," she said, her voice gentle, rehearsed. "Spring break's coming up. We're thinking of taking the kids to Florida. You should come." I hesitated. I hadn't left Savannah in years, not since August's health began to decline. "I don't want to be a burden," I murmured. "Don't be silly," Serena replied quickly, reaching across the table. "It would be healing. We could all use it. The kids miss you. Todd said you deserve some sun." The word healing snagged something inside me. The idea of sand warmth, noise, something besides the airless routine of grief, it stirred against the numbness. I nodded slowly. "Everyone's pitching in," she added casually. "Flights aren't cheap these days. We're booking soon." That night, I opened the jewelry box I hadn't touched since the day I folded August's clothes for the last time. The ring he'd given me on our 25th anniversary still sat in its velvet case, plain, warm gold, with the faintest scratch where it had rubbed against my wedding band for decades. I sold it the next morning to a man who didn't ask questions. The money went straight to Serena, in cash. She didn't even count it. "We'll handle everything." "Mom," she smiled, "just get your beach things ready." I never saw an itinerary, never asked. She said she'd send all the confirmations later. She never did. But I packed my suitcase anyway, just a few things, and the old photograph of August laughing in the garden. I tucked it in the side pocket, beside a towel I hadn't used in years. I never imagined I wouldn't see either of them again. The line at the gate moved in slow, tired stretches. I clutched my folder, its corners bent from handling, and stepped forward when the attendant waved me closer. She took my paper, scanned the barcode, and frowned. That little pause, that subtle shift in her eyes. I knew something was wrong before she spoke. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This ticket doesn't show a return leg." I blinked. There must be a mistake. I'm traveling with my daughter and her family. Monroe. It should be under Monroe. She looked again. Yes, I see the Monroe reservation. 6 passengers, all one way to Fort Lauderdale. I don't see a return flight booked under your name. My mouth went dry. Could you check the luggage, please? Mine should have been checked with them. She nodded and called someone, voice low and efficient. I stepped aside, disoriented. Through the glass wall of the terminal, I spotted Serena and Todd sitting near a coffee kiosk. Her sandals were kicked halfway off, and she was laughing at something on her phone, while Todd sipped espresso, legs crossed like they were waiting for a spa appointment. I made my way over, holding the useless folder in front of me, like a schoolgirl with a failed report. "Serena," I said softly at first, then again louder. She looked up with practiced patience. "What's wrong?" The attendant said there's no return ticket in my name. She didn't flinch. "Oh, right. We figured you might want to stay a few extra days. You've got all the time in the world, Mom." It made more sense this way. I stared at her. Todd didn't meet my eyes. He leaned back, tapped his phone. "You're retired," he added, without feeling. "You'll figure it out." I tried to steady my breathing. "My suitcase," oh, Serena said, dragging out the syllable. "We checked everything curbside. Yours too. It's probably still with ours. We'll get it back to you if you need." They stood then gathering bags with choreographed ease. "Boarding call," Serena said brightly. "Enjoy the sunshine." And then they were gone, swallowed into the security line, without a backward glance, like I had never been there at all. I sat stiffly on a bench against the far wall of the terminal, far enough from the gate to no longer hear boarding calls, but close enough to feel every departure like a small tear. My hands were numb. My breath came shallow, as if my ribs had forgotten how to expand all the way. I didn't cry. I had cried at August's bedside, at his funeral in the grocery aisle, when I saw his favorite cereal. I had run out of that particular currency. Now, I just sat a woman-shaped shell in a public space where no one lingered long enough to ask if I was okay. My purse sat in my lap like a weight I wasn't ready to open. But I did, slowly, methodically. I reached inside beneath the tissues and mints, past the emergency aspirin and the glasses case. I found the inside zipper, the one I almost never touched, and worked it open. Tucked behind the lining was a small tan envelope, flattened with age but still sealed. My fingers shook as I slid it out. On the flap, August's handwriting, "Just in case they ever try you." He said that once, half joking, when I had told him I didn't trust the way Serena talked about money. Keep something tucked away, he'd told me, just enough to leave the room with dignity. Inside, the envelope was $980 in crisp 20s and a worn business card that had survived too many wash cycles. Josiah Rue Estate and Trust Law. I stared at the name for a moment, then pulled out my phone. The screen lit up. Full battery. No messages. I tapped the number from memory. He answered on the third ring. Josiah Rue. I didn't greet him. I didn't explain. My voice was calm, almost clinical. I need to update my will. Immediately. There was a pause. Then he replied, "Come in whenever you're ready, Callista." I folded the envelope back into my coat, zipped my purse, and stood. I might not have had a suitcase or a return flight, but I still had something they didn't count on. I still had control. Josiah's office hadn't changed. Same walnut bookshelves, same brass lamp on the corner of his desk, casting warm light over documents people usually signed in grief or urgency. He looked older, thinner, with deeper lines around his mouth, but his eyes were just as sharp. "Callista," he said, standing as I entered. "I didn't expect to see you. I'm sorry about August." "Thank you," I replied, simply lowering myself into the chair across from him. I reached into my bag and pulled out the copy of my old will, folded once down the middle, and placed it on the desk. "I need to revise this entirely." He glanced at the names listed, then back at me. "You're sure I'm not doing this in anger, Josiah? I'm doing it in clarity." He nodded slowly and opened a fresh file. I watched him prepare the page, his movements practice precise. For a moment I saw August sitting beside me again, his hand resting gently on my knee as we reviewed these very same lines years ago, thinking we were securing something solid for our future. "I want Serena Monroe and Todd Monroe removed from all beneficiary designations," I said steadily. "That includes the house, the farmland, the trust account, and the college savings plan." He didn't flinch, just scribbled notes in a clean hand. "Who replaces them?" "Elder Haven," I replied. "It's a nonprofit that provides support for seniors abandoned or exploited by family. I've already contacted their director. They're expecting a gift of property and assets." Josiah looked up from the page, his gaze heavy with understanding. "You've thought this through. I've lived this through." We moved on to the accounts, checking savings, the investment fund August, and I built over 3 decades. I showed him recent activity Serena had made without my knowledge. He clicked his tongue softly and shook his head. "Let's start freezing everything she touched. And we'll move the rest to a separate management entity, one in your name only." I signed where he pointed steady, hand-clear eyes. One stroke at a time, I was reclaiming what they had assumed I'd never defend. It had been 6 quiet months. The kind of quiet that doesn't ache but restores. I had grown used to the sound of birds in the morning and the creak of floors that didn't echo with anyone's demands. I no longer jumped when the phone rang. I simply didn't answer unless I wanted to. The email came early on a Tuesday. The subject line was short, "Please read." Serena's name blinked in the sender box, familiar and foreign at once. I opened it. "We didn't think you'd actually go through with it. I know you're upset, and maybe we deserve some of that. But this cutting us out of everything, it's too much. You're still our family. At least let us keep the garden." That was the line that made me pause. Not the apologies, not the excuse about misunderstanding my feelings. The garden. They meant the acre behind the house, the patch of green August, and I had turned from clay into something soft and full. The place where we planted zinnias and sugar peas, where Serena took photos for her social media, but never once bent to pull a weed. The garden where she staged Mother's Day, brunches with folding chairs and mimosas while I served behind the screen door. She wanted it now. For the children, she wrote. For their memories. But that garden no longer belonged to them. 2 weeks after signing the revised documents, I had contacted Elder Haven's director and offered the land behind the house as part of the gift. They had toured the space with quiet reverence, speaking in hushed tones about shaded benches, raised beds for arthritic hands, trellises for memory walks. I watched them walk it with more care than Serena ever had. That garden was going to be something living again. Not for filtered photos or seasonal posts, but for women who needed to feel their hands in the earth and remember that they were still real. I closed the email without replying. There was nothing else to say to someone who only missed you when you were no longer available to use. The first thing I noticed was the light, real light, not the flicker of fluorescence or the sterile brightness of waiting rooms. Sunlight poured through the windows at Willow Ridge, like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for someone to open the door and let it in. A woman at the front desk stood as I approached her smile, reaching all the way to her eyes. "Welcome, Ms. Haverford. We've been expecting you." My throat tightened at that. Expecting me. Not tolerating, not accommodating. Expecting. As though I wasn't an afterthought, but someone who belonged. She handed me a clipboard and a pen, walked me through the check-in with gentle precision. Room number, meal schedule, community events. No pressure, just options. I nodded where I needed to, signed where I should, until we reached the line labeled emergency contact. My hand hovered above the blank space. For a long time, I used to write Serena's name there, automatically. Even after August passed, I'd left her name on my doctor's forms, on the pharmacy records, on every slip of paper that asked who should be called just in case. But I didn't write it this time. Instead, I lowered the pen and whispered more to myself than to anyone else. No emergency contact, just me. The woman at the desk glanced up but didn't flinch. She nodded as though it wasn't strange at all, as though a person could belong fully to herself and still be whole. She handed me the key to my room. I thanked her quietly and carried my small suitcase, packed not with obligation, but intention, down the hall to the corner unit with a view of the courtyard. Inside the space was clean, warm mine. On the bed was a welcome basket with a note that read, "We're glad you're here." I sat in the armchair by the window and let the quiet settle around me, not like silence used to sharp and punishing, but like a quilt pulled up just right. A stillness I chose, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt safe enough to breathe. The notifications were delivered at 9 a.m. sharp. Josiah had arranged everything just as I asked, professional, formal, irrevocable. Each envelope was addressed, stamped, and signed for. I didn't need to witness the moment they opened them. I already knew what was inside. By 11, my phone began to ring. At first, I let it vibrate on the side table untouched. The first 3 calls came from Serena, then Todd, then Serena again, back and forth, like a volley of desperation dressed in entitlement. I watched the screen light up with their names, then fade back to stillness. By the 6th call, I turned the sound off. By the 10th, I stopped checking the screen altogether. But it was the 12th call that made me look again. Mark. His name flashed softly on the screen. Just Mark. No photo, no emoji hearts like there used to be when he was little, and asked me to pick him up from soccer. I stared at it, unmoving. My thumb hovered over the answer button, but I didn't press it. He let it ring. He didn't leave a voicemail. 4 more calls came after that. 16 in total. I counted them without meaning to, as if the number itself meant something, as if each ring was a measure of how long it had taken them to realize I had truly shut the door. That evening, I sat in my room at Willow Ridge. the golden hours spilling across the floor, like a kind reminder that the world was still turning. I pulled my journal from the drawer, the same one August once gave me when he said, "You keep too much in your head, Cal. Let it have a page." I opened to a fresh one and wrote with a steady hand. They mistook my silence for weakness. That was their mistake. I capped the pen, closed the journal, and slid it back into the drawer beside the spare keys and the welcome note I hadn't yet thrown away. I stood up, slowly stretched, and walked down the hall toward the soft sounds of music from the common room. They asked if I would lead a class something simple, light, social. I almost declined. I wasn't sure I had anything left to offer, but Helen, with her quick wit and relentless nudging, said, "You've got too much story not to teach others how to tell theirs." So I started a small workshop on Tuesday afternoons called Letters for the Next Life. The idea was simple. Write the things you'd want someone to know after you're gone. Not legalese, not instructions, just the truth, the parts we leave unsaid because no one ever asked. At first, only 3 people came, then 5, then 10. They brought their grief, their humor, their regrets. One woman, Marlene, wrote a letter to her cat. Another wrote one to the husband she never divorced but never forgave. I wrote 2, sometimes to August, sometimes to myself. Outside of that, my days began to form their own rhythm. Sunday tea became a tradition, just a few of us on the patio, with mismatched mugs and old gossip. Storytelling circles popped up on Wednesday evenings, soft voices around the fireplace, swapping tales that started with, "You won't believe this, but..." And on Thursdays I painted, not well. My trees leaned too far. Left, my flowers looked like they were melting. But it didn't matter. I liked the sound of the brush moving through water, the way colors spread where I hadn't planned. It reminded me that beauty doesn't require permission. One evening, just before dinner, I sat by the window with my journal in my lap. The sun was dropping behind the courtyard, turning everything copper and calm. I wrote without pausing. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you refuse to let be stolen. That garden, that land, that silence. They had tried to write me out of my own story. But I had picked up the pen again, steadied my hand, and started something new, something mine, something I chose. The next morning, I would return home one last time, not to revisit what I lost, but to claim what still belonged to me. I waited 6 months before going back. Not because I needed that much time to be ready. No, I was ready long before. I waited because I wanted the silence to settle, to harden into something solid beneath my feet. I waited until their absence no longer echoed in my chest. I arrived on a Tuesday morning, just as I'd planned. Serena and Todd would be at work. I didn't want apologies or explanations or one more strained attempt at reattachment dressed up as remorse. I wanted quiet. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The shutters sagged. My garden had gone wild with weeds, as if it knew no one loved it anymore. The spare key was still tucked in the planter by the front step. We'd always kept it there just in case. I slipped it into the lock and walked through the door like I had every right, because I did. I didn't take much, just August's old reading chair, the one with the imprint of his shoulders still sunk into the back cushion, the quilt my mother made for us on our wedding day, and the photo album we kept in the side drawer, its leather cover worn from hands that flipped through it far too often in the lonely weeks after he passed. I walked the house slowly, touched nothing else. I had already said goodbye. Before I left, I placed the keys in an envelope on the kitchen counter and wrote in firm, slanted letters, "Do not call. I am exactly where I want to be." Back at Willow Ridge, I unpacked what little I had brought. I placed the chair by the window. I folded the quilt over the back. I slid the album into the bookshelf between my journal and a copy of To the Lighthouse. Then I sat at the easel and began to paint. A tree, tall and bending slightly in the wind, but firm in its roots. When the brushwork dried, I took a black pen and wrote one word in the corner, "Rooted."